Shalom Lukolam. Hello, everybody. My name is Paul Gross. I'm a senior fellow at the Menachem Begin Heritage Center here in Jerusalem. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to a very important and special webinar that we're hosting here on Zoom for an audience based in Israel and the United States and the UK and Canada and many other places besides. Some of you are regulars to our English events and will know that I routinely speak to Israelis and non-Israelis about topics to do with Israeli politics and history, the wider Jewish world, the wider Middle East, and other things. In the last 2 months, of course, all of our collective attention has been focused on the events of the 7th of October, the aftermath, and most of what we've been discussing here so far has been to do with what's been happening here in Israel. With good reason. But there's an awful lot happening outside of Israel, which is equally consequential, I think, for the Jewish people writ large. And we wanted to discuss that, not least because our audience is made up of people living outside Israel and Israelis with one foot in the diaspora, so to speak, or certainly who come from places outside of Israel. So I've invited a truly wonderful panel of speakers today. We're going to hear from each of them in turn. I might put a couple of questions to them, and there'll be time for you to put your questions as well. If you look down at the bottom of your screen, you'll see a Q&A button, Q&A little icon at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can enter your questions into that function, and I will make sure to put some of those questions to our guests. Now, the topic we're going to be discussing, the title of our webinar is Betrayal of the Universities. And it's really, I think betrayal is really the right word, because universities are supposed to be places of truth-seeking, of inquiry, of understanding, of gaining knowledge, of learning about the other. And instead, Jewish students have increasingly found, and particularly in the last few weeks have found, that they are places where Jews often do not feel safe. And that is not just a consequence of their fellow students, but also in many appalling cases of faculty, of professors, academics in those institutions. I'm not going to list all the things that you'll have seen in the news on social media in the past few weeks. I'm sure many you will have seen some of the videos going around in the days after the professor at Cornell, who declared himself to be exhilarated by the horror show on October 7th. Just today, actually, I saw on Twitter advertised at the Columbia School of Social Work this Wednesday, in fact, so anyone in the New York City area can free to attend this wonderful event, a teach-in discussing the significance of the Palestinian counteroffensive on October the 7th and the centrality of revolutionary violence to anti-imperialism. So it's good to know that the hefty fees that Columbia students are paying is going to some important stuff. And of course, it's not just in the United States, in the UK and elsewhere. We'll hear more about the UK later from one of our speakers. Many of you will know I'm originally from the UK. If you didn't know, then you probably do know after hearing me for a few seconds. But a friend of mine, his daughter is studying at Nottingham University in the UK, and they had Israeli flags up in solidarity for the massacre, and those flags were torn down, and "Kill Jews" was scrawled on the wall next to their dorms. So this is an epidemic, I think, that we're dealing with, and very much worthy of a discussion. So we're going to hear from our speakers. So we're going to start with Dr. Rachel Fish, who in 2021 co-founded the nonprofit Boundless, a think action tank partnering with community leaders across North America to revitalize Israel education and combat Jew hatred. She also serves as the special advisor to Brandeis University Presidential Initiative to Counter Anti-Semitism in Higher Education. She's an associate research professor at the Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies. She also teaches Israeli history and society at George Washington University. She's been the executive director of the Foundation to Combat Anti-Semitism, a senior advisor and resident scholar at the Paul E. Singer Foundation in New York City, and executive director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, where she trained the next generation of academics in the field of Israel studies. She's a frequent speaker in various Jewish community forums. She co-edited the book Essential Israel, Essays for the 21st Century. Rachel Fish, it's a real pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much, Paul. It's a pleasure to be with my colleagues and to meet new faces. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with the Menachem Begin Heritage Center. So I have, I believe, 10 minutes to give a little bit of a framing here. So I'm going to do that and then hand it back to you, Paul. I would like to just start by saying what we see playing out on college campuses did not begin on October 8th, meaning the issues that we see playing out have been for generations. They have been cultivated. And for the most part, the Jewish community was not focused on these issues. They didn't have their eye at all on what was happening in the campus community. And there are a couple of elements that I think are relevant to understanding what is taking place on campus. And I'll just name those and then explain briefly. One, the intellectual factors that contribute to creating a hostile environment on campus, particularly as it pertains to the fields within the humanities. Two, funding issues within the university. Three, university administrators and how they think about issues related to Jews and in some cases even Israel. Four, faculty, which I believe Dr. Sara Hirshhorn will dive into more detail about. And then five, the influence of outside agitators and the role that they play. So very, very briefly, let me just talk about each of these. The intellectual factors. These intellectual factors, it's important to note that if taken individually, can have real value when doing any serious academic work, whether that's in the fields of history, comparative literature, sociology, anthropology, etc. But the challenge is when these intellectual factors are taken as a whole and they become the primary prism through which to view all issues. That's the challenge that I have seen emerge over the last 20 years. Some of these intellectual factors include ideas like post-nationalism, post-colonialism or decolonization, Marxism, and ideas around postmodernism. Now, again, if you look at these at face value, they can be useful tools to have in an academic toolkit in terms of critical thinking skills. But when combined all together, and when they are used as that primary lens, they set up a very, very simplistic narrative. The simplistic narrative goes as follows. One, there are no objective facts. All facts are debatable. All narratives are equal, and narratives weigh more than facts. And the goal of power is to weaken those who are strong and to strengthen those who are weak. And if you are powerful, most likely you are part of a white colonialist identity, and you usually are trying to oppress a dark-skinned, native, indigenous, powerless people. That very, very simplistic framework, which is quite superficial, becomes a pretty steadfast formula and trope that can easily then be applied to Jews who are perceived as an extension of Israeli behavior and Israeli action, and Israel is perceived as a white colonialist imperialist entity that has displaced the dark-skinned native population of the Palestinians. That's the simplistic narrative. I would argue that narrative needs to be challenged. I would argue that narrative is rarely challenged. And now we have a point in which you can see the justification of violence, of terror, of rape and murder in order to then not condemn Hamas, but to laud and celebrate the actions of Hamas, because the narrative is one in such that it says everything is justifiable in order to liberate and to resist the colonialists. So you can see how this then plays out and is applied and transposed onto the Israel conversation. That's piece one. Piece two, funding. The universities have been taking funds from very problematic countries, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, of course, also we could look at China and Russia, but specifically as it pertains to the conversation around the Middle East, Qatar and Saudi Arabia, even the United Arab Emirates are key to understanding this. The universities have been bought. They not only then have been bought financially, but it influences the centers that have been developed, which influences not only then the centers, but who teaches in those centers. That extends not only to the current undergraduate community, but it also extends then to public outreach initiatives, specifically K through 12 educational programs. We see these programs at Georgetown, Columbia, Harvard, and other places, and they have enormous influence in terms of the discourse that extends way beyond the ivory towers and into school systems. Many of those teachers are not ill-intentioned, but they assume that what they are being taught is with good intent, and it has the hechsher of the university and therefore is kosher, and don't understand the problematic challenges associated with the content, the materials, and the framing they are receiving. Issue number two. Number three, university administrators. Administrators, for the most part, tend to be conflict averse. They tend to also perceive Jews as part of a white majority and do not understand Jews as a minority, let alone as an ethno-religious community. That sets up all types of challenges in terms of Jews being able to express what is happening, whether it's on the campus quad, whether it's in the classroom, whether it's with student organizations. And because many university administrators hide behind academic freedom and freedom of speech, the way in which the critique of Jews then emerges, which goes well beyond critique and often into anti-Semitism, is a presentation that this is just critique of Israel or critique of Zionism, which is deemed to be politically correct. And they don't understand where that crosses into anti-Semitic sentiment. I am very clear, critiquing Israel, everyone does that, I know. Every Israeli, every Jew, every non-Jew. What we're talking about is the starting place. Does Israel have a right to exist? And the answer is no. So that's issue number three with the university administrators. I will also just add that compounding the university administrators framework is around the diversity, equity, and inclusion, sometimes now inclusion and belonging framework. Jews do not fit into that paradigm. And so therefore, that in and of itself has to be challenged. It is not to say that there isn't important work that can't be done that is about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but when it excludes particular communities and doesn't address them and continues to advance ideas in which it creates systems that do create silos between these communities, something is broken. Number four, faculty. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I'm going to give it to Sara, but I'll say two things about faculty. Faculty love academic freedom, as they should. But there seems to be a component of academic freedom that is forgotten, which is the flip side of that, which is academic integrity and responsibility. Just because you have the ability to say and do what you want in theory doesn't mean you actually have the right and responsibility to do so. Academic freedom, the idea, once again, it's not a 20th century invention. It's actually from the Middle Ages or the medieval period, was the idea that if you have actual expertise in a subject area, then you may use that subject area expertise in the classroom, in teaching, but it doesn't give you the right to promote your own polemical or political ideological agendas at any given point. That's why, at least in the American context, you have the American Association of Universities that ultimately set up parameters to say what is off limits and what the limits are for academics in the actual classroom. It is the responsibility of the university to actually uphold those policies and implement those policies. We have in our universities, faculty who feel compelled to use their classrooms as political pulpits to promote their own agendas. And usually it falls along the lines of that intellectual framework that I suggested. It is very challenging for many students to be able to critique, question any of the positions their faculty present due to their concern, the students' concern around power dynamics, power relationships, and grades. The university administrators tend to fall in line in supporting the faculty because of academic freedom, once again. And it poses a system then that students do not know how to navigate, particularly when those professors are also department heads and have outsized influence in the university conversation. And most administrators cow to those faculty, and the faculty then ultimately are informing and creating policy. The last issue is outside agitators. There are lots of organizations that exist on campus as it pertains to some of the organizations that are most relevant to the conversation that we're discussing. Those organizations usually are Students for Justice in Palestine and Jewish Voices for Peace. Both of those organizations tend to be associated with outside agitators. Those agitators are problematic in a few ways. One, they can use very vitriolic language and at times even behavior in order to incite and create a hostile environment on campus. SJP in particular has a problematic source of funding associated with it. Jonathan Schanzer from the Foundation for Defense of Democracies presented a few weeks ago at the Ways and Means Committee, in which he shared who some of those individuals and organizations are, which are also associated with Hamas and other terrorist entities. This was not new information. This was presented in 2016. It's just nobody paid attention. So he presented more information that's pertinent in a few weeks ago. We also have, in terms of those outside agitators, no sense of responsibility in terms of upholding the policies and the positions created within the universities around how you actually engage in speech and how you create an environment that is inclusive on campus and civil. That is not their intent. And so therefore, it can cause a lot of challenges on campus for the students and of course for the administrators as well. So those are the pieces that I would lay out in terms of really trying to unpack and understand the different aspects that exist within the ecosystem of the university. And I am under 10 minutes.
Thank you very much. That was admirably done in a short space of time. You gave us an awful lot of very important information, and I think which nicely sets us up for the continuing conversation. Dr. Sara Hershhorn is our next speaker. She's currently a visiting professor at the University of Haifa's Rudiment program in American Jewish Studies and Compass Center for the Interdisciplinary Study of Antisemitism and Racism. They should really pick something shorter for the title of that, I think. But she's also the inaugural fellow at the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League Center for Anti-Semitism Research. She was previously visiting assistant professor in Israel Studies at Northwestern University and the University Research Lecturer in Israel Studies at the University of Oxford. Her research, teaching, and public engagement activities focus on diaspora-Israel relations, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the Israeli ultra-nationalist movement. Her first book, City on a Hilltop, American Jews and the Israeli Settler Movement, was the winner of the 2018 Sami Rohr Prize in Jewish Literature Choice Award and a finalist for the 2017 National Jewish Book Award. It's a great book, recommend it. She's currently working on a new manuscript entitled New Day in Babylon and Jerusalem, Zionism, Jewish Power and Identity Politics since 1967, that will offer a transnational history of the post-Six Day War period. Apart from her academic work, Dr. Hirschhorn is an internationally recognized public speaker, writer, educator, media commentator, and consultant on contemporary Jewish Israel affairs. And we're very happy to have you with us, Sara. Could you speak to us, please, about your experience as an academic, as an out Jew and Zionist and expert on Israel who can tell us something about what's going on in academia?
Yeah, I hope you'll allow me the permission to speak freely for a few moments,
Please.
just from the heart of what I've seen. When my doctorate was conferred upon me at the University of Chicago, as each PhD student is handed their diploma, they are welcomed and embraced into what they call the ancient and honorable community of scholars. And I have to ask myself, where has the honor been in the community of scholars since 10-7? Where is the intellectual integrity that Rachel has spoken about so eloquently? Where is even the need to protect young, vulnerable minds from, horrific discourses like I was exhilarated about, Hamas's atrocities on 10-7? Where is an appreciation for the idea of critical thinking, or that the community of scholars is not one of dogma and, slavish Stalinist following of certain kinds of frameworks, but one rather that embraces the intellectual integrity to follow research and scholarship in any direction that demanded, and that to use multiple frameworks and viewpoints to interrogate very serious and complex ideas or issues like the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. To narrow these simply to a set of slogans, be it genocide, apartheid, settler colonialism, state violence, seems to me extremely reductionist, not just on the part of the public, but certainly on the part of scholars who have more tools, I would hope, than the average to be able to analyze these very, very complex and nuanced subject matters with interdisciplinary focus and with a variety of intellectual tools. So it saddens me and frankly shames me to see what has happened in the academy. And I must say that each and every one of us who are faculty members, I suppose in some ways, bear some responsibility for what has happened, either intentionally or unintentionally, because the system, to my mind, at the moment is broken, and we have to see whether it indeed can be fixed. So I wanted to speak a little bit more to some of the issues that Rachel had already raised, mostly in reference to where faculty have a role in this debate. Rachel has very helpfully laid out a number of frameworks that have become quite dominant in the academy, certainly in the last 20 years, but even going back further, and I want to speak in a moment a bit more historically, but certainly in the last 20 years, they become almost complete dogma in the universities to the exclusion of any and all other frameworks that could and should be applied to the topic. Once again, each one of these frameworks has value in its own right, and it is possible and I think permissible to use them. I think there's much hesitancy, maybe particularly say in the Hasbara community, for using the word settler colonialism or otherwise to describe the Zionist project. And we have a terrible failure, I think, as academics, first and foremost, of describing what Zionism in the state of Israel is, because it can be settler colonialism and many, many other descriptions for what Zionism is that would add complexity to understanding, a phenomenon that has now been in existence for over 100 years and seen many different iterations. But more than just the intellectual variants that we find being used in the academy, it's not just, I guess, their intellectual substance, but I want to say, I guess, a word from the point of view of faculty about what goes into that from a bureaucratic factor, that it's not just that faculty kind of slavishly or kowtow into these variety of frameworks that is necessary, that one must, tick the box in every presentation you give at a conference, in every article that's published in a journal, and every book, proposal that you write, but also that there's a huge amount of academic gatekeeping that is going on to reinforce and reinvigorate the usage and only the exclusive usage of these various frameworks. There's it's strange that many faculty members spent their years growing up in post-colonial studies reading Michel Foucault's Discipline and Punish, because that is exactly what's happening in the academy today for faculty members and frankly also students, and particularly MA and doctoral students that are seeking to have a career in this field, that if you don't use the right frameworks and you don't kowtow to the right individuals and ideas, you're going to be disciplined and punished for your activities. And while there certainly is a huge problem of labor in academia that has nothing to do with politics, there's also an enormous problem that has to do strictly with politics, in the sense that if you ever hope to get a job, and that today is something that is very difficult for any number of reasons because of the market of academia, but certainly if you have the wrong politics, don't aspire to that kind of career path. And I think it really also limits the number of new students who professors are training, because, you know, if you're not interested in being mentored within these frameworks and essentially embracing this entirely, and to do it with some degree, I think, of conviction, and not just to fake it until you get, until you get tenure or until you're rewarded, I think it becomes very difficult really to see academic career advancement and training because of this. So there's a huge bureaucratic influence as much as an intellectual influence on these set of discourses. But in addition to that, I think we have to also think about some of the larger historical patterns that go back before the last 20 years. The first is I want to point that's specific to the American context, and I think explains a little bit about why we've seen this eruption of both physical and verbal violence on American campuses since 10/7, is because the United States is really the only Jewish diaspora that's been having this completely, to my mind, ahistorical debate about whether anti-Semitism emanates from the right or from the left. Certainly of late, this debate has intensified, but for the most part, the United States has embraced a model of the new anti-Semitism that essentially says white nationalism is the greatest threat to Jewish safety and security in the United States, and whatever's happening on the left is maybe some old remnant of of the past, but nothing we needed to be terribly concerned about. I think 10/7 has hopefully shaken that paradigm, but I'm not really sure that most of the American Jewish diaspora has entirely internalized that there are also threats from the left, and that the model of allyship, which has been so pivotal to the understanding of Jewish identity and safety, may need to be rethought, especially in terms of who our allies really are, and how the American Jewish community might position itself going forward. And this has been very relevant to discussion on academic campuses, particularly because academic campuses historically were the epicenter of the split between Zionism and identity politics. This we can trace back to the 1960s and 1970s. I'm writing a book about a lot of this right now, and the campus space in particular has been extremely instrumental for setting the tone for the larger American agenda. What today we might talk about as being from dorm room to boardroom, or dorm room to halls of Congress, even began back in the 1960s and 1970s. And one particular way that I think the academic space has been very pivotal here is not just embedding a certain set of discourses that emanate mostly from post-colonial theory and other adjacent disciplines, but also the idea of identity politics as a legitimate academic discipline in and of itself is something that came about on university campuses in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly the idea of both Jewish studies and Black studies, which later then, spawned a whole number of other interrelated disciplines, Latino and Latinx studies, Pacific Islander studies, Hispanic studies, you name it. But these were all sort of originated in a clash on college campuses in the 1960s and 1970s, particularly on a campus that, Rachel and I have both spent time at. Brandeis University was one major important center of this. It's actually the place where Black studies was founded in 1968. And Jewish studies also came of age at the same time, but they took very distinct paths that I think are worthy of spending a moment on, that tell us a lot about the way university culture has been shaped ever since, which is that Jewish studies decided that it really wanted to follow the path of the Wissenschaftsjudentum, a kind of scientific and neutral way of teaching the Jewish tradition, particularly with some kind of textual exegesis, using the most critical and newfangled scholarly methods to do textual study. Black studies and the other ethnic studies programs took a very different approach. They said that our ethnic studies programs are looking at what would be the millennials in the 1960s or the millennials in the 2020s, that this is specifically an identity inculcation device. And what we are to do here within these programs is to teach the languages, the cultures, the traditions of our people, whoever that people was, and to send our people off into the world with the tools to identify within the in-group, but also to serve as activists on part of our community. Despite the fact that Jewish studies came into being because of the demands of Jewish students who are looking very much for the same kind of things. In the end, the professionalization of Jewish studies took it in a very different direction, which is the last thing the Jewish and Israel studies has really wanted to do today, is to inculcate any kind of Jewish or Zionist identity in their students. They may be willing to teach about the topic, but it doesn't have the same embedded agenda as other identity studies programs. And I think we can ask ourselves, if we had, taken a different road back in the 1960s, will we still be where we are today on campuses? I'm not sure there's a clear answer to this, also because of what Rachel alluded to, that the faculty essentially are quite unpoliced on campuses, and administrations have various reasons, because first, campus administrators usually are themselves academics. Academics with, slightly better bureaucratic skills than the average, and that's how they get appointed to those positions. But they come from the academic community, and they have very little desire to police other academics, and certainly because of the sensitivity around free speech are unwilling to do so. But I think also because DEI, or diversity, equity, and inclusion, has actually even failed to, in some cases, to recognize Jews as a category worthy of discussion at all. We actually found this out quite belatedly at Harvard last week when they approached the DEI administration, and it turned out, oops, Jews were never even part of this framework altogether. So there are some obstacles to this that go beyond the decisions that were made 50 years ago, but I think we could consider, if different paths have been taken then, where we might be today. The last thing I want to say is that I think that this isn't only about Zionism and Israel, Jewish identity, and 10-7. I think that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict for a long time has really just been the canary in the coal mine of a broader dysfunction about tackling serious debate, and the campus being an important and integral part of the public square, particularly in American life, but more broadly in Western life in UK and other countries. There's a huge problem on campus in general. And this is maybe only one small window into it. So something that we probably should keep in mind when we're trying to devise solutions, to not be so narrow-minded and thinking only about this issue in and of itself or in isolation, but to a broader set of questions. The last thing I wanted to say is I had a very interesting conversation with some colleagues of mine in Johannesburg just last night. And one thing I think we can see from the South African model, which has experienced, maybe an even harsher conversation around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the campuses there have been, very active for an even longer time than they have been in the US or even the UK, although I lived in the UK during, the Corbyn debate, so I'm very well aware that, this mobilization happened sooner. But what I think we can see from that model is that if you don't nip this in the bud on campuses, or it's not contained to the campus, it very easily spreads into civil society, into politics, into governance, into the economy, into the whole ideology of a nation state. So that is perhaps a very strong cautionary tale about why what's happening at universities today is so significant, because what happens on campus doesn't stay on campus. What happens in Las Vegas doesn't stay in Las Vegas. And we need to be very aware that we have to tackle these issues with a great sense of urgency. Unfortunately, an urgency that I don't feel from campus administrators or faculty at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much, Sarah. That was really informative and useful. We'll get back to you with some questions in a while. Okay, our next speaker is our Israeli abroad, Shai Romy, who's Israeli-born but studying in the United States for an LLM at the University of Pennsylvania Law School. For those that don't know, that's, I believe, a postgraduate degree for lawyers to expand their areas of expertise. Shai is an administrative lawyer who worked in the private sector and the High Court of Justice here in Israel in the state attorney's office. His work and research focused on human and civil rights issues. Shai actually comes from a bereaved family. His grandfather was murdered in a terror attack near Kibbutz Erez, not in October 7th, but some time ago. Before his army service, Shai volunteered for a year in coexistence in the Negev and worked with Palestinians who escaped Gaza and received shelter in Israel. His program manager there was Vivian Silva, who some of you may have read about. She was murdered by Hamas on October 7th and was notable for being extremely involved in coexistence efforts between the kibbutzniks on the border and Palestinians in Gaza. Shai, thank you so much for joining us, for being our native-born Israeli on the panel, and also giving us a student's perspective. And I think it's useful for us to hear your perspective, not just as a student, but specifically as an Israeli student, looking at this unfolding before you at the University of Pennsylvania. Please let us.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Begin Center, for hosting this event, and for everyone who came here today. I would try not to repeat things that already said and give my personal perspective as an Israeli Jewish student. But before I start, I just wanted to highlight that this is my own experience, and other Israelis on other campuses may experience the last 2 months differently. And it's also changed on between schools. So just to mention that. I guess you're all familiar with the Spider-Man quote that with great power comes great responsibility. So as I see it, the university has two responsibilities for the student. The first and the most important one is to educate them. And the second one is to make sure they are safe. And the university, and especially the University of Pennsylvania, failed to do both. Rachel talked about it, that the story of anti-Semitism around campus did not start on October 7th. For example, in the University of Pennsylvania, 2 weeks before October 7th, on Yom Kippur, the university hosted a Palestinian literature festival, which in general is a positive thing. But as it appeared, the festival involved extremely anti-Semitic speakers like Roger Waters or Mark Lamont Hill and other speakers who made claims about how the Jewish money controlled the US, or compared between Israel and the Nazi regime. And where people, including the ADL, said that they welcomed the festival, but tried to warning the university that it provides a stage for anti-Semitic speakers. The university attacked them for not respecting the academic freedom. Right after that Hamas attacked on Israel, even before Israel took a single action in Gaza, anti-Semitism toward Israel started to raise its head. Pro-Hamas students organized protests on campus around the city of Philadelphia, and they expressed their support for Hamas and their anti-Semitism. The first protest took place on the following Sunday, October 8th, where the main speaker announced that he salutes Hamas. For them, everything just started to go downhill. Students at rallies just usually wearing masks, chant genocidal phrases like "from the river to the sea," "there is only one solution," implying for the final solution, Intifada, Zionism is racism, and more. And usually those protests were referred directly to Jewish students. Sara just asked me about Goldie, which is the Israeli restaurant that vandalized yesterday on a pro-Hamas protest. Those things happened on a daily basis. We became very used to those things. And also swastikas, graffiti started to appear around the campus, like places like Merson Hall. Students and even few professors ripped down hostages posters. Some of them replaced them with cow hostages posters. Many professors signed an anti-Semitic statement, including one of my human rights professor in my law school. Hillel received a bomb threat, and student protest against Hillel giving halas on Shabbat, which has nothing to do with Israel. And just like those are like just few examples. Again, it's like it's a regular thing on campus. And while after October 7, those things happen regularly around the campus, the university tried to stay neutral. The first public email I received from my law school was on October 10th. And the email offered all student mental health support. And the mail opened with the words, and I quote, "The violence in Israel and Gaza became deeply unsettling difficult for many in our community." Again, we're talking about October 10th, 3 days after the attack. And that was the first public response. So I contacted the school, and I went with the school administration, and I said that I expect the school to express moral position. And to be honest, I was shocked by the response. While she said that she's personally agree with everything I said, she also said she's afraid to offend the feelings of Muslim students. So I tried to explain that condemning terror should not be a political or religious issue. And then she asked me to try to draft a statement that everyone on school can agree on. I said that morality is about right or wrong and not about being likable. And she didn't accept that. And I also mentioned that the tense situation at the university started to get scary, and that I'm Jewish enough to know exactly what's going on to come. So for that request about anti-Semitism, the answer was that if I feel a friend around campus, it might be helpful for me to use their mental health support. Because as it appeared, the problem then was in my head and not at the university. And after that, the school made a new policy to not making statement on everything that doesn't have any connection to the law school. And I think the big problem is that the heads of the school had good intentions. And I really mean that. Almost all of my teachers in the law school acted the same. They're all afraid to respond. All of my teachers came to me or sent me lovely emails stating full support, but never in class, never publicly, including professors I saw in Israeli or Jewish rallies in the city. I don't know if you remember, but 2 months ago, we argued in Israel about the judicial reform. And for months, we heard law scholars arguing and trying to spread their truth. That's what I think that academia should do. But at Penn, for example, students who study international law and hear claims about war crimes in Israel don't hear anything from the teachers. Instead of analyzing those claims in class, they are educating themselves on TikTok. And it was not entirely, but most of the professors who spoke loudly were the pro-Hamas ones. So a lot of my friends decided to avoid places on campus or minimize their Hebrew or take down Jewish symbols. I try to do the opposite and be more loud and more proud of who I am, but I fully understand anyone who chooses differently. Especially after every claim that students made turns against them, and they were accused of doxing or harming the freedom of expression. On October 18, for example, the university president sent an email saying about the pro-Hamas protest that this week campus demonstration come at the time when many members of our community are fearful and experiencing tremendous pain. Peaceful protest and all that comes with it is a feature of the campus life. As a university, we support free expression. And again, we remember what those protests were. The university started to change its tone only after donors started to withdraw their donations and after President Biden made a statement of anti-Semitism. And it's important to say that as individuals, the university and especially the law school were excellent. They helped us financially, they gave us study support and were very open to hearing everything we said. I don't know if that's the situation everywhere, but that was the situation in Penn. But as individuals, we don't matter. The story here is not about us, it's not about me, it's about morality and about the role of universities. I think that the headline of this event is the betrayal of the university, but I think we must highlight the treason of the intellectuals. Instead of being a moral beacon, speaking the truth and developing intellectual question, they decided to surrender to politics and betray their role in the world, which is simply educate people and educate those students. For me, I find it mostly sad, but I believe, and maybe that's the message for me to in this event, that everything that just happened during those 2 months prove how important it is to speak clearly and loudly, because if we don't do it, no one will.
Shai, thank you very, very much for that personal account. I think it's really important and useful that we hear that. As you said, it's not the experience of every Israeli student or on every campus, and obviously campuses are different, but I think we all know enough from what we've read to know that what you're describing is certainly not limited to the University of Pennsylvania, unfortunately. Okay, let's move to our final speaker, David Hirsh, Dr. David Hirsh, Senior Lecturer at Goldsmiths, University of London, and the Academics Director and CEO of the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. He's pioneered a sociological account of contemporary anti-Zionism and its relationship to anti-Semitism. He's worked on crimes against humanity, totalitarianism, democracy, and populism. He teaches core sociology, criminology, crimes against humanity, and human rights courses. He was central in building what was called the Engage network in the UK, a network and a website that led opposition to the proposal for an academic boycott of Israel from 2004. He led the fight against anti-Semitic politics in Britain, especially on campus. He was a leading critic of the ideas underpinning the Corbyn movement, and he's been instrumental in shaping the democratic and Jewish responses in Britain and further afield to anti-Semitism. He has a global reputation as a scholar and leader of the fight against anti-Semitism. He's appeared as an expert witness in a number of court cases and inquiries. He's written formal reports and has chaired a university academic appeals panel on anti-Semitism. He also wrote an excellent book on anti-Semitism from the left, which came out a few years ago, which everyone should read, and is becoming, sadly, increasingly relevant. David, thanks so much for joining us. I wanted to get from you how things look in the UK, and maybe something also about your institution, the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and how its work plays into this current situation, how it's responding to this current situation. I think one of the interesting things to note is, or one of the, I think, important comparative points is that obviously in the UK, you have a much smaller Jewish community, and therefore often a Jewish community that feels more vulnerable, I think, than often it does in the United States, and also a government which, while certainly not anti-Israel by any means, doesn't have the same historical relationship of being, the great ally of Israel, the special relationship with Israel that the United States has. And so I think in the UK, there's always less, there's less sort of an instinctive feeling among British Jews that the government is always or almost always going to be supportive on these issues. Anyway, with that brief introduction, I'll turn it over to you.
Nowhere near brief enough. Good afternoon. I want to try to communicate something about the feeling on campus at the moment, because, I mean, all the other speakers, everything they said was true, but, well, more or less, but I want to try to tell you that so let me say it like this. There were two really interesting pieces of fiction in the late 90s. One was Breaking Glass by Arthur Miller, and the other was a play that Arthur Miller wrote when he was very old, and it was great. It was about a woman in New York in the late 30s, and she was reading reports from Europe, from Germany, about the pogrom Nacht, the state pogrom night, and about the tightening grip on German Jews. And she was becoming more and more worried and agitated and depressed, and everybody just told her not to worry. Don't worry too much. It's going to be fine. You're fine. Everything's fine. And the play is a really brilliant study of how she could see this anti-Semitism that other people around her couldn't see. In fact, New York Jews around her couldn't see. And in the end, her legs are paralyzed, literally, because she's paralyzed, because she says, look at all these things that we're reading about that's going on. We should be worried. And everybody says, no, don't worry. And I think roughly at the same time, Philip Roth wrote Plot Against America, which now looks like it's about Trump, but I don't think it was ever about Trump. I think it was about the left. And I think that Roth used a kind of plot device to switch it round to say, well, you'd recognize this if it came from the right. But again, what he's writing about in Plot Against America is an anti-Semitism which the Jews, the Jewish community in New Jersey, where it's set, they can see it and they can feel it and they're threatened by it. But the whole world around them just can't see anything, can only see, nothing terrible, nothing threatening, paranoid Jews. Even the son of the family in that novel goes off to the countryside to learn how real Americans live and comes back having worked on the farm and with a tan and eating bacon every morning and says how wonderful America is. And it's just this feeling of an anti-Semitism that you can see and that you are very aware of, that people around you just can't see at all. And that's how it feels, I think, to be on campus. It's also how it feels to be listening to the mainstream radio news in the morning in Britain. It's also how it feels reading the newspapers. And I think that's very difficult to deal with. So I've got lots of stories too. I could go back to the mid-80s when I was a student, and people started saying Zionism is racism. Why is Zionism racism? Because it says that the state of Israel is only for Jews and it's not for all its citizens, and it prioritizes Jews and the Jewish rights and Jewish experiences. And Zionism is racism. Therefore, Zionism is incompatible with the values of the student movement, and therefore there should be no Jewish societies recognized by the student unions. And again, it just feels and seems like a kind of pretty straightforward, quite radical, interesting argument. And if you can see it, if you understand it, if you understand that, you know, the overwhelming majority of Jews in one sense or another have a relationship to Israel, which is not just accidental, but is part of their Jewish identity, then you begin to understand that, you know, Zionism is not just a kind of theoretical abstract idea, but it is part of who we are, but in a complicated sense. And one of the things that Zionism is racism does is it refuses to allow us to define who we are. So people will come at us and they'll say, ha, you're a Zionist and Zionism is racism, therefore you're a racist. Israel is the apartheid state. You defend Israel, therefore you are pro-apartheid. Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. You defend Israel, therefore you're a defender of genocide. And so Zionism equals racism, equals apartheid, equals genocide. By the way, it can't be all of them. You know, Nazism is very different from apartheid, is very different from genocide, is very different from actually settler colonialism. But none of that really matters because the words have a moral force, which just mean you support the worst thing that we can think of. You are of and you are supportive of the worst thing we can think of, just as anti-Semitism in days gone by accused Jews of rejecting and murdering God, or rejecting and being traitorous to the nation, or rejecting and being traitorous to the working class and the revolution. Whatever it is at a particular moment that is thought to be the very worst thing, and that is thought to be organized by a quiet and secretive evil which you cannot see, a conspiracy. People will remember George Orwell's 1984. In 1984, there was a dystopian future in a totalitarian state And every day there was a ceremony which was called 2 Minutes Hate. And you would, at work or at school or at university, you would go and watch the telly screen for 2 minutes and you would hate. And what would you hate? You would hate the face of the traitor. And the traitor was called Emmanuel Goldstein. And he was treacherous of the revolution many years ago before he was expelled from the party. And literally there's a ceremony of 2 minutes hate, and you hate the Jewish face. And I think that's very redolent of the meaning of anti-Semitism, really, which is to give a face to that which is evil, and to give a face to the unseen power and the unseen conspiracy. I also think that anti-Semitism is about, I think a really common experience of anti-Semitism is to take people who thought that they were at home somewhere. In my case, in a sociology department. I don't know what I was in my early 30s. I was very proud to be in a sociology department, one of the coolest sociology departments in Britain. I remember sitting in department meetings, looking around and thinking, I'm one of these people. Isn't that incredible? And I thought for a moment, in spite of my imposter, what's it called, syndrome, I thought I belonged there. I was at home there. And then I learned that I wasn't. And the way that I learned that I wasn't is because there was a movement for the boycott, the academic boycott of Israel, which means excluding Jews, excluding Israelis from our campuses, and excluding Jews who are defined as supportive of those Israelis or who have links with those Israelis from our campuses. And I thought, this is fun. I'm one of these guys. I'm clever. I can make an argument. I understand racism and anti-Semitism. I'm going to make an argument and I will impress everybody with my brilliance and we will win. And long story short, my whole department filed into the union meeting. And I thought, that's funny. That lot don't normally come to union meetings. And I had gone to the meeting with 5 or so colleagues who were supportive from the whole university. And we lost the vote against the boycott by, there were 5 votes on our side. And all the other votes went against our challenge. And from then on, I understood that suddenly I didn't belong. I was not part of it. I was not a sociologist anymore, because how can you be a sociologist and a racist? How can you be a sociologist and a supporter of apartheid? How can you be a sociologist and a breaker of the boycott and a breaker of solidarity? You can't. So then I became a person who's very clever and cunning and who understands sociology, but is able to pervert it and twist it and turn it upside down and use it in defense of everything that is opposite to the values of sociology. And that's how I was seen. Howard Jacobson, the novelist, tells the same story. He was once a novelist and then he became a Zionist novelist. And Luciana Berger said that she was the proudest person in the world when she became a Labour MP. But then she became a Jewish Labour MP or a Zionist MP, or as they said about her, the Right Honourable Member for Tel Aviv. And she was not anymore at home. And when they find out that you're pretending to be at home in the community of the good, but that you're not really at home, then they understand that you're not only in the wrong place, but you're in the wrong place on purpose, right? You're pretending. You're pretending to be a sociologist. You're pretending to be in the Labour Party. You're pretending to be in whatever space it is that you're being pushed out of. And then you get the Livingston formulation. Let me explain. Then you get accused, if you raise the issue of anti-Semitism and you say, look, you're a sociologist, you must understand anti-Semitism, you must understand conspiracy fantasy, you must understand, in fact, that some of the very founders of our discipline were people who took anti-Semitism very seriously and who were trying to create a structural account of human society which could explain inequality without resort to conspiracy fantasy. You must understand this. And they look blankly. And you say, look, there's an issue of anti-Semitism here. If you're going to boycott Israelis but no one else on the planet, why? Why this special emotional wish to block, to boycott, to exclude, but only Israelis and not anyone else? And they look at you and they suddenly relax and they say, aha, we know what you're up to. This is what Dave Rich said. He said, anti-Semitism is the idea that we know what Jews are really up to. And what they're really up to is trying to silence and to delegitimize criticism of Israel. How do we do that? We do that by saying that the criticism of Israel is the worst thing in the world that we can possibly imagine. It's the thing that created the Holocaust. It's anti-Semitism. What a dirty, dirty trick. It's the dirtiest of dirty tricks. To respond to somebody who is standing up for the Palestinians and who is critical of Israel by saying, you're anti-Semitic. It's a dirty, dirty trick, and those people should be treated badly. So before anyone takes me too seriously, and one of my kind of superpowers, I think, is that I'm quite good at being able to think like an anti-Semite, right? I can do this because I've been around them a very long time. And if you thought that Israel was committing genocide, if you thought that Israel was trying to wipe out thousands upon thousands upon thousands of children and babies in order to fulfill some kind of ulterior motive, if you thought that, you would be angry. And you would be angry with people who support that, or people who say, you should be careful how you criticize that. So really what I'm trying to do is to say that, especially in England, right? In England, the anti-Semitism is, and ironically, because it's all post-colonial, right? But it's also exceptionally English, of course, because a lot of post-colonialism is exceptionally English, and it's understated, and it's not even stated. No one's ever mean to me. No one ever says bad things to me. They just freeze me out. And they don't let me publish in the journals, and they don't let me have research funding. And then because I haven't published in the journals and because I don't have research funding, they don't give me a promotion and they don't give me a professorship. And then they say, well, to be honest, if you had published better, you'd be in with a better chance. So I suppose that's the key thing I want to say really to begin with is it's not easy and it's not obvious, right? People are not, yeah, somebody, I can see the comments that sounds like 30s Germany. Well, it does sound like 30s Germany if you understand that 30s Germany was a place where Nazism was attractive to exciting young radical people, right? To Martin Heidegger, to the radical philosophers, to the, you know, that Nazism rejected the sort of stupidity and the hypocrisies of bourgeois society, and it tried to radically change everything, and it tried to find the root causes. So if you think it sounds like Nazi Germany, understand Nazism like that. Understand Nazism wore Hugo Boss uniforms, right? And understand why people were excited about Nazism and attracted to it. That might be a difficult message to hear, actually, but I think it's really important because we have this idea today that Nazism was this very transparent thing, right? We from kind of 1950s war movies, and we see this kind of epitome of evil, you know, Nazi kind of goose stepping around saying evil things and rubbing his hands in an evil way. But even Nazism wasn't like that. And today's anti-Semitism is not like that. Today's anti-Semitism is embraced and defended and excused by the good people. by the people who really care. They care more than us. So I want to try to explain that it's not easy. It's not easy to recognize it, and it's not easy to deal with it. Very quickly, let me say something about the London Centre for the Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism. We think that there is a hostile environment to the study of anti-Semitism, and there's a hostile environment on campus to anyone who wants to engage with anti-Semitic scholarly thought. The way you engage in debate on campus is by writing books and by writing research papers and by teaching and by doing research. It's very expensive, it's very difficult, it's slow, but there's no other way to engage with Judith Butler or with the well-funded and intricate and very thorough work on genocide studies or on intersectionality or on post-colonialism. You have to engage with that work in an academic way. So what we're interested in doing is we're interested in creating an infrastructure that makes research possible for us, creating scholarly community that makes research possible for us, and enabling us to engage at that very high level. And we believe that without that very high level of engagement, you're kind of stuck with firefighting. And we want to try to take on some of this thinking at its very highest level. And, you know, we actually understand intersectionality better than most of the people who talk about intersectionality. And we understand colonialism and post-colonialism better. And we certainly understand Marxism and critical theory better than most of these people who, parrot Adorno and then say we should boycott the Israelis. I mean, it's amazing. Anyway, I will stop there and hopefully there'll be a little more time to engage.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate that. As a fellow Brit, I recognize a lot of it. Also, I would say the way you started when you talked about the feeling of just noticing something that no one else around you is noticing. I realize living in Israel, of course, I don't have that in my everyday life, obviously, but whenever I go online and I go unwisely onto social media, I realize that people are living in a completely different reality. I engage in conversation, again, unwisely perhaps, with people outside of Israel in the United States and the UK and other places, and that I feel like they're living in a completely different world to me, where nothing that I know to be true, is accepted, or is treated with suspicion or disdain, or a sort of kind of grudging, resentful silence. It's very unnerving. Anyway, we have a lot of questions. I have some questions myself, but we've been inundated with questions from the audience, so I want to get to those, and then maybe if there's time, I'll put some of my questions afterwards. But let's get to the questions that we've been put by our audience. You can keep writing them, everyone. I can't promise to get to all of them, but we'll see what we can do. So there's a question from Isabel, who asks about defunding colleges, about whether, I think this was an idea that Brett Stevens put forward, and I guess it's mainly relevant to the American context, but defunding colleges, in particular schools where Jews don't feel safe. Maybe Rachel, if you want to go to that.
Sure. Thank you, Shai and David and Sarah, for your comments. I found them very valuable. I'll just give a quick response to the idea of defunding. I'll tell you that when I was working with students at Columbia University, and this is 2004, 2003-ish, and we were helping them develop a documentary about what was happening on campus, and much of it was about what was happening in the classroom. When we shared that documentary where students gave their testimonials, and to your point, David and Sarah, not a single faculty member was willing to go on camera, even though they themselves had their own experiences. And we had some students who needed to have their faces blurred on the camera, their voices masked. Whether or not they actually would have any kind of consequence, they felt they would have a consequence for speaking up about what was happening on campus. And I recall sharing the documentary, which is entitled Columbia Unbecoming. So again, 20 years ago already, we saw this happening and no one wanted to take it seriously. And when we showed the film to key donors who give massive amounts of money and have their names on many of the buildings associated with that university, their body language said it all. They would start to slouch in their chairs. They couldn't make eye contact with me, with the students. They'd look down. And yet they weren't willing to do anything. They still said, well, these students need thicker skin. Or they said, well, you know, this is my alma mater. It's more than just this one class. And they continued to give money because the reputation and the association with that alma mater was more important to them or deemed to be of more value than actually supporting the Jewish students, Zionist students on campus. Now, if you fast forward to today, we know that Mark Rowan and several other philanthropists have sort of started a movement, Shai, some of it starting at Penn, because they said, we're done. We're done actually supporting these institutions of higher ed that purport to be the marketplace of ideas, and yet they're actually conforming to a very particular set of ideas, and they're not allowing for heterodoxy. They're not allowing for multiple perspectives. They're not allowing for critical thinking. And so Mark Rowan and others are now following suit in order to pull their funds from the institutions of higher ed. Now, whether or not that's good or bad, we don't yet know. Many of these universities are corporations. They have lots of money. And so therefore, it doesn't mean necessarily that pulling their funds is going to have any significant, meaningful impact. And if they're already receiving a ton of money from Qatar and Saudi Arabia, who cares? To be honest, who cares? That being said, I'm going to say three things, and they all may contradict one another, and that's okay. One, it is important to actually give where you think there is integrity. So do not support an institution that doesn't have that integrity and doesn't take Jewish concerns seriously. Number two, if you're going to actually invest much earlier, much younger, because you need Jewish students who know who the hell they are and are deeply rooted in their particularism and understand how to identify and have a Jewish operating system through which they can then walk through the world, tightly holding on to both particularism and universalism. Number three, the issue of funding. Why I do care about the institutions of higher ed is because it's not just about Jewish students. You are educating a generation of citizens, global and American, who ultimately it impacts their ideological orientation, their worldview, how they vote, how they think about foreign policy issues. And if you completely cede that space, it is highly detrimental long-term to how we think about all of those other communities outside of the university that Sara mentioned: politics, business, media, social justice causes, because everything that happens on campus spills out into the real world. So they're not mutually exclusive in terms of the funding issue, but if you have significant dollars, think carefully about where you give them in order to have the biggest impact long-term and return on investment.
Thank you very much. Sara, did you want to add something to that point about the defunding idea?
I have to agree with everything that Rachel has to say here. I guess I just wanted to pivot a little bit to other sources of funding. There's been a conversation now happening in the United States about federal funding, state funding, other forms of financial support for the university. In a sense, I guess, kind of conditioning aid to universities, we might say, based on their behavior and their performance around these issues. I think that this, unfortunately, is going to become extraordinarily politicized, frankly, because most of those who are supporting this and in fact actually are supporting, Jewish and Zionist viewpoints today, or come from the Republican Party, which is, not friendly on a university campus in any sense, and certainly not when it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So that's a bit problematic. The other thing is that I think there will be challenges from faculty and everybody else about essentially conditioning free speech. Free speech has become so iconic within the university that there's almost no way to to have any kind of meaningful conversation, even about anti-Semitism. We see several anti-Semitism task forces that have been organized on various institutions, I think at Harvard, where I was most recently teaching at Northwestern University, and each of them have been challenged on free speech grounds. And we can critically engage with this question of whether there is actual anti-Semitic verbal and physical violence on your campus, because this is a abrogation of rights to free speech, particularly of Palestinian free speech. So I think that ultimately those will go in that direction. The one issue that I think is maybe more interesting to me, that's less about defunding, but is more about legal cases, is there are now Title VI challenges. Title VI is a, I guess, enshrined doctrine within U.S. government about equality within institutions and discriminatory behavior. So there have now been several suits brought against a variety of some of the most elite universities in the United States on the grounds that anti-Semitic activity on their campus has violated Title VI entitlements. And I'm interested to see where those will go, and also other external organizations that have sued specific university campuses like the Brandeis Center, which is not affiliated with Brandeis University, I should hasten, but is a separate, I guess we can call it sort of human rights Zionist law center, has brought suit against the University of California, Berkeley, again, under these questions of equality and anti-Semitism. So we'll see where these have to go. But I think the sad thing that we're learning from all of this is that nothing is going to happen on campuses, to my mind, without some kind of external shock. Because there's no, frankly, internal policing mechanism to change the way things happen. Yet, as Rachel has mentioned, even that may not be sufficient. So whether or not we see these spaces or not, I'm not exactly entirely clear on how we can reform their behavior. My own feeling is that when it comes to the issue of defunding, without necessarily leaving the current universities behind, I argued in a piece in Fathom Journal, which was just published last week, that I think that there also has to be some serious thought given to creating new forms of allyship with different partners, and also a set of parallel institutions, because of ultimately survival in the diaspora, including, I guess, intellectual survival, we could say, may also be predicated on living almost as a state within a state, which may bring us to the point of what do you need a state within a state for when you have an actual state? But I don't think that's going to be the solution that most diaspora Jews are going to choose. And, we'll have to look towards that. I guess maybe that's one last thing that I should mention, is that, of course, some of these donors who said they're going to defund American universities are also thinking about sending students to Israel. We'll see whether that actually materializes, but that is an interesting possibility or model about where donors may choose to put their funds.
Okay, thank you very much, both. I want to put a question to let's say to David and Shai, and then to Sara and Rachel afterwards. There's been a few questions along these lines which are about how to respond to colleagues, I guess academic colleagues, or in Shai, I'd say in your case, Shai, other students who are part of this, maybe people that you previously had good relationships with, who are friends, who are signing the horrible statement, the pro-Hamas statements, people that are, like the people you talked about, David, who, suddenly start looking at you differently, and seeing the Jew rather than the sociologist or whatever. And this question, how do you respond to those kinds of things? What's the best way of dealing with those things? And maybe let's try and, you can speak more broadly, but let's also ask the specific question of, in the current context, let's say one of your colleagues or one of your fellow students, Shai, has been essentially pro-Hamas or very explicitly anti-Israel, or denying the reality of what happened on October 7th or whatever. How you respond to that? Maybe let's go to you, Shai, first.
Yeah, I will be quick. I think there's two different types of people. The first one is people that want to know and want to ask the questions, and for those people, I'm trying to provide as much information as I can. And usually when I talk with those people, I'm really successful with convince them or even change their approach. And I do see the impact. But on the other end, there are a lot of people, they already made their decision based on what they saw on mostly on social media. And for those, yeah, it's not working, and I think we have to see in what time we have to stop trying, and basically.
Right, who's the lost cause? Who's not worth wasting your time on? Yeah, I understand. David, what about you? Because there was one of our audience actually says, Raquel says, I've been accused of all the things mentioned by David Hirsh by one of my oldest former friends, a professor of political science and peace studies, needless to say, at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. And she says, what are your suggestions for us as a community, not personally, moving forward with these kinds of things?
Yeah, I have no idea at all. I think it's incredibly difficult. I remember the first time I had this idea about people being pushed out of the place where they thought they were at home. I was speaking to a woman whose father was actually a Second World War hero. He was a Czech fighter pilot, and he had spent the war in Britain, and she had been born in Britain, actually, and then he had rushed home to Czechoslovakia in 1945 to build socialism, and because he believed in it. And then, of course, we know that by the early 50s, him and the General Secretary, Slansky, and 11 others were hanged on the charge of bourgeois Jewish nationalism. And this guy was not hanged, but he was put in the uranium mine, and he came out 11 years later with lung cancer. And she also said that even amongst the other families whose people were in the uranium mines, there was no fellowship, because they were largely right-wing Christian families with huge families. And of course, Jews didn't have huge families at that moment in Czechoslovakia. So just this idea of being suddenly, I mean, thank goodness the people we're talking about don't have uranium mines and they don't have state power, which is, it sounds kind of flippant, right? But you know, look at the stories from Poland and East Germany in 1967, 1968. Even what was left of the Jewish intelligentsia was purged extraordinarily in Poland. I mean, there were people who didn't know they were Jewish who were suddenly purged as Zionists. It's extraordinary if you think about it, how that works. So I don't know. I had a colleague of mine in my department came and sat next to me the other day, and she found me in the coffee bar, and she sat next to me. She's German and an expert in critical theory and Marxism. And she sat down with a very gentle voice. She said, "How are you? How are you?" And I said, "I'm all right, you know, not bad." And are all your people all right? And I said, "Yeah, but you know, the young people are in the forces, and you're writing statements accusing them of genocide." And the poor thing looked at me and kind of all hurt, really. And, you know, with that sort of "I didn't mean you" face. And actually then drew me into a whole hour's discussion. The main thing of which I remember is that she was happy to speak more loudly than I was in the coffee bar, because I think she would have been very happy to have some help. And I wouldn't have been happy for other people to kind of hear what we were talking about and to come and join. And I don't know, I spoke to her for an hour and I told her some things that she hadn't thought of. And I know that she hadn't thought of that these kinds of statements people make have, you know, actual concrete political outcomes. And that's one of the things
for a second, and also say that I think that they also think that we're sort of faceless, that when you come and say this causes me pain, it's like some kind of absolute revelation that you're a human being that, you know, objects to these statements. And personally, I found it very helpful. I don't know that I got any kind of actual dialogue out of it, but just to say what you are saying is hurtful, or your silence is violence, because that's what you would say to me, or your, you know, my pain is real, or it's not, you know, me too, except for Jews, or whatever it is. But I think like you have to make your pain visible, because I otherwise think that it's like Paul says, you know, you go on the social media, you see this absolute abstract reality that certainly isn't, you know, what we're facing here in Israel. And I think that some of these people just have not internalized that there's someone on the other side of the screen or someone on the other side of the petition that they're actually doing harm to, because it's all some kind of theoretical construct. Well, I believe in settler colonialism and genocide and state violence, so I'll sign this petition. But to me, it's just a theoretical proposition. I've never really thought about it in a real world context. I'm sorry to interrupt, David. I just got so excited about your point.
No, you're very welcome. Actually, so that there was another incident a year or so ago where the president of the student union quote tweeted me and said that I was a far-right white supremacist. And she said that because I had said that there is an anti-Semitic edge to official university campaigns of decolonization. And actually, I should explain that very quickly because it's a very straightforward point. If people say that Zionism is colonialism, and if they then say that there should be an official campaign of decolonizing the curriculum and decolonizing the library and decolonizing the university, then why shouldn't some people feel licensed to de-Zionize the curriculum and de-Zionize the university and take Albert Einstein and Hannah Arendt out of the curriculum? Why not? So what I meant by there is an anti-Semitic edge to decol was very straightforward. And by the way, also, why would one left liberal value, which is decolonization, be made into an absolute and raised up above all the others, right? There are other values too. There is de-Stalinization and denazification and liberalization and democratization and the rule of law and the right to free speech and any number of liberal and left values. Why on earth would the university pick one and make it the official creed? It's a kind of madness. And fine, if people have that as their intellectual framework, that's fine. They can teach according to that intellectual framework, but they're not going to make me teach according to their intellectual framework, which is not my intellectual framework. Anyway, where was I? So I was denounced as a far-right white supremacist. And long story short, again, my own trade union branch then went onto Twitter and offered the student union president 100% solidarity against some of the criticism that she got for that. So the official voice that is paid to speak on behalf of our students said that I was a far-right white supremacist, and my own union said I was a far-right white supremacist. And the thing, Sara, that keys in with what you just said is that actually some of the colleagues in my own department in the union were quite sympathetic. And they kind of came to me and said, that, why, you know, they can't say that about you. You're all right. And they went to kind of fight my corner in the union branch. And there was this kind of excruciating week or two where the union guys from the sociology department were going and having a fight with the union branch about whether it was right that I should be called a far-right white supremacist. And part of me wanted to say to my colleagues, why are you suddenly defending me? Why, you know, and the only reason is because they know me, right? Because they know my face and because they know my teaching and because they know I'm not really a Nazi. And if they didn't know me, the people from the other departments, you know, didn't care at all. So,
right, this is the point, right? This is what Sarah's point about putting a face to the abstract Zionist, evil Zionist on the other side, and I think that is important, and I guess it does speak to, you know, what we all know about human nature, that we can relate to human beings much better when we actually can sit across the table from them and speak to them. But clearly it's not enough in every case. And I actually wanted to ask, I think Shai, it was you that said that there were the pro-Hamas teachers were not scared to speak, right? That it was the ones that were quietly saying to you, are you okay? We're on your side, but wouldn't say it publicly. So I wanted to ask you, and then maybe ask the others as well, why, like, how do we Jews, and I guess people that have some sort of way of lobbying our governments and our university institutions. How do we make the pro-Hamas teachers scared? Because to my mind, they should be scared. Like, why shouldn't they be scared to stand up in public and say, I support a genocidal death cult that's massacred 1,200 people in this disgusting way? Like that should be the thing that people are scared of. So I'm just interested, Shai, from your perspective, what in your estimation, why was this guy, I don't know if it was a guy or woman, why were they not scared in your view?
Honestly, I don't know. But I think it's connected to the same reason why the school administration didn't want to go publicly and say they condemn terror, because being against Israel, as I feel right now on campus, is the cool thing. And being against Israel is something that people very free to do. So yeah, no one, and I saw the question, and someone asked if one of the professor said anything about that professor, and the answer is no. I mean no, publicly.
Wow.
Can I just add one thing here,
please.
Paul, which I think connects to David and Shai here. One of the reasons it's okay and perceived to be okay by these faculty to use the rhetoric that is pro-murder, pro-rape, pro-Hamas is that ultimately they see themselves on being on the, quote, right side of history. The wrong side of history is the side of history that David's talking about, meaning the perception that Israel was born in sin. And that ultimately, because Israel is born in sin, we're not talking about 1967, we're talking about 1948. And if Israel's born in sin, who are you to defend it? Someone who must then be a racist, someone who must support all of the worst human rights rhetoric that is used and manipulated in order to bludgeon Israel. You support apartheid, you support white supremacy, you support racism, you support genocide and ethnic cleansing, and all of that is lumped together. And so the faculty I have found who obviously don't believe that, but ultimately they won't say it out loud. They are concerned about personal and professional repercussions. They won't get invited to speak at certain conferences. They won't get published by some academic presses. We know this, like this is fact. We're not making this up.
Yeah.
It'll be very difficult to get a new course into the departments that they teach in. It will be very uncomfortable at every single departmental meeting, let alone in a personal situation for a social event. And for the most part, they'd much rather keep their heads down, and they have a DNA, one I don't have, which is why I'm not full-time in the academy. They have a DNA that ultimately is about not rocking the boat. How many faculty have I met with when Jewish students and Zionist students come to them who say, just do your work, keep your head down, don't say anything, just graduate. Where I have to tell you, the other side says, rock the boat. Have a sit-in, demonstrate, use violence. And they're okay with saying every single piece of that. And not only are they okay with it, they get tenure, they get published, they get to speak at the best symposium that there possibly is, and probably get paid by Qatar and Saudi Arabia while doing it. Like, this is insanity. And yet this is what is happening within our institutions of higher ed. And if we don't reclaim them, we have a serious, serious problem about the education of the next generation.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think that's really profound, and something that I think we should all bear in mind. I'm aware that we're already over time. We could talk about this for much longer. I do want to just end with this, and maybe everyone can answer relatively briefly. That there was a question which I think should be important for all of us, and maybe other people are thinking this as well. And I think all of you, from your different perspectives, have something to say on this, which was, how do we help the children, the kids, the young people heading in to college to feel empowered to deal with anti-Semitism? And I think, and I don't know whether I think that you'll have, as I said, you'll have your different answers to that. But I think that it seems to me that increasingly that's going to be the question, because one thing that's clear from everything that all of you have said is that this problem isn't going away anytime soon, and it's not easily dealt with. And as much as we're going to, hopefully there will be good things done by good people, including defunding when necessary, including working with friendly political figures and leaders on these issues. Nevertheless, it's we're really up against a sort of it's a David versus Goliath situation. I feel that's what it feels like, and so we do need to prepare our young people for these things. So maybe we'll just go through each of you, and you can before we close, and each of you can just say a little what you would advise a parent to tell a young person, or maybe the young person themselves. So let's go the opposite way around we started. So David, I'll start with you.
Okay, couple of things about money and funds. I think there is really a scandal, in particular in Jewish studies and in particular in America. I think that a lot of Jewish studies is funded by 3 or 4 generations of Jewish people in America, people who had done well, people who'd made some money, and they thought, what can we do that will be good in a very general way for Jews, and what will be good, and what will be good for us as a family. We'll give money to the university because universities are good. Jewish studies sounds good. Israel studies sounds good. We'll give them money. And what has happened in many places is that money, by a process of academic freedom and academic autonomy, the money is being used to pay for people who have values that are fundamentally in opposition to those families who donated. And there was a story in Seattle a year or so ago when one lady, who I think happens to be 102 years old, said, I'm pulling my money, pulling $5 million out of the Jewish Studies department at Seattle. And the Jewish Studies faculty went bananas, right? They stamped their feet and they said, we cannot be at the beck and call of these donors. There's an issue of principle, which is academic autonomy. It was astonishing, actually. So we have to be very careful. People have to be very careful if they donate money. They should donate money to us at the London Centre. I'm kind of joking, but they should donate money where they know that it's going to be used according to the values that they want it to be used. And it's not a trivial point. And the kind of Jewish studies in America, not completely, right? There are very many good people in Jewish studies, but there are many people in Jewish studies who really, really do not want to be bothered by this politics and by being typecast as the Zionist, the pro-Israel. They want to get on with their interesting research on Yiddish poetry or on Talmudic study or whatever it is they want to do, and they don't want to be singled out as the Jews on campus. They don't want to stand in the dock for Israel. They don't want to be made to be the scapegoat. And on one level, fine, but on another level, Jewish studies is in trouble. And it's in trouble because not the whole of it, but there is a part of it which is completely accepted by the whole of it as legitimate, which were the people who wrote and pushed the Jerusalem Declaration, which was an attempt to discredit the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, etc. So there's a problem with Jewish studies in particular. You would think that if there was anti-Semitism on campus, then Jewish studies would be standing up for the Jewish students, but they're not. And that is really appalling, I think. What can you do? I don't know what you can do. I mean, really, we have to teach our kids to be able to have an intellectual fight. And it's not easy. And, I'm really ambivalent about saying that because, Rachel, Jewish students should have the right not to have a fight. They should have the right to go and study their Talmudic poetry or physics or chemistry or whatever. And I often said that if Jews don't want to get engaged politically, they can keep out of this kind of awful anti-Semitic milieu, because the anti-Semitism isn't across the whole of campus. It's in particular places. And then at my university a few years ago, suddenly they said that if you want to play rugby for the college, then the rugby team is going to have a BDS patch and a Palestine flag on the uniform. So suddenly, even if you keep out of politics and you play rugby, suddenly then you find yourself either having to stay silent or to have a fight or to walk away and play your rugby somewhere else. But, you know, some of the Jewish kids are going to have to learn how to fight in an intellectual and smart and a strong way. My book might help for Hanukkah. There's the old book about contemporary left anti-Semitism, and there's a new book coming out. One of the things we're doing at the London Centre is putting out a series of books because, like I say, research outputs are the way in which we engage with serious ideas on campus. But it's really not what my grandparents thought that my kids would be doing, right? When they came to England and built themselves a new life, they didn't say that my great-grandchildren are going to be running around on campus looking after Jewish students who are getting abused and denounced and marginalized. They didn't think that. They thought that we'd be, you know, normal people by now, but we're really not.
Yes, indeed. Okay, well, thank you, David. And I should say my colleague Milia has written in the chat the URL for David's center, the London Centre for Contemporary Anti-Semitism, Study of Contemporary Anti-Semitism, and also the URL for Rachel's organization, Boundless. So please check those out. Shai, what would you tell the parents or the young person? You're muted. You're muted.
Sorry. I think that the thing that helped me the most was to unite with other students that are like me. You know, when I talked about it, that when I complained about anti-Semitism and I was referred to mental health, I felt terrible. And the first thing I did was to connect my friends at JELSA, which is the Jewish Law School Association. And they helped me to feel that I'm not crazy. You know, that's the first thing. And we saw those groups develop and become bigger and bigger because people actually need it. And also after I realized that no professor will talk publicly, I started to contact them privately and had a discussion with them. And that's what helped me to feel that I'm okay, the opinions I'm presenting are okay, and there is a problem in the world and in your universities, and we have to solve it, but it will take a lot of time. And until then, we'll just have to unite with other people and make our things.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the important thing, right? Anti-Semitism is not the Jews' problem; it's the anti-Semites' problem, right? That it's the anti-Semitism is this pathology, right? So it's the anti-Semites that have some kind of mental illness, if you want to put it that way, not the Jewish, not the Jews on the receiving end. Thank you, Shai.
I have to do a quick follow-up for that. But 2 weeks ago, we had a truly white supremacist, a person he's proud of being white supremacist. He came to school, and the entire school.
It wasn't David, was it?
No.
Because I heard he was a white supremacist. I'm just saying.
That's a guy, I forgot his name, but he made awful claims against Mexicans. And there was a protest inside the school, you know, and I approached my Mexican friends and I said something that they didn't like to hear for the first second. And I told them that I'm happy for you guys that you have the ability to feel like Jewish for one day. And we had like a full discussion about it, and I think that they actually got to realize the problem and understand that anti-Semitism is not only against Jews; is a global thing, and it hurts in that Mexicans and as it hurts Jews.
Right. Thank you, Sarah.
First, I should just say that, you know, thank God I don't have any children, but I don't have a child who's preparing to go to university right now, because I think it'd be a quite frightening situation to send, you know, a young, vulnerable person on the cusp of adulthood who, you know, as we all know, when you go off to university, you're learning to be away from home from the first time, and then maybe to find yourself, as David had says, not at home in this new home of yours, and that's a very difficult situation. I agree with Rachel that in terms of the conversation about anti-Semitism, Jewish and Zionist identity, that can't start at the door of the university. That had to start maybe at birth, because it's a very long process. And I think about what my parents put into me with the resources that they had, which maybe were not the resources that someone other family might have, or for better or for worse, and how much effort it took to really inculcate that identity in me, so that when I came to university, I was prepared to come with an open mind, and that I wasn't I wasn't a propagandist, that in fact I was very able to engage with others who had difference, but also that I was rooted in my own identity and my own values, and to really have a conversation around identity and values, and not just and I think also love of Israel. And I think Rachel may probably say the same, because I think she taught me this herself, that in order to be a fair critic of Israel, I think you have to be rooted first in love of Israel and not in hatred of Israel, because that's where the deepest and most profound critique can come from, is from those who love. But I think the last thing I'd say is, once again, to return to this idea, this is a canary in the coal mine of a broader problem about having difficult conversations. And I had a student who came to me who was in my class on Zionism, and of course, taking a class that has Israel or Zionism in its title is already a great act of bravery on campus, because maybe no one will sit next to you in the cafeteria for the next 4 years of college. But he told me that not only was he having these debates about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was the third rail of campus politics, but in general he wanted to engage with ideas that he was unfamiliar with, or in fact really actually actively opposed. And he told me that he went to a conversation with a Republican senator who had been invited to campus, and he came out in the dark at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and other students were shining a flashlight in his face and chanting, "Shame, shame on you for having attended this lecture." And I think to myself, what kind of constitution do you have to have as an 18-year-old at a university to be able to endure that? And I don't know what it takes today, but it's going to take the efforts of a village, of parents, of educators, of friendly faculty, of everyone who can, support these young men and women who are encountering such difficulty, and to have for him to have that level of respect for difficult conversations and engagement, I thought was so profound. And maybe really the kids are all right. They have something more than we do, because they're able to do things that I never would have been able to tolerate that age. And I know that fellow faculty, who are 3 times their age, are unable and unequipped to do so. I think we just have to do everything we can and just be so proud of these young people for what they've been willing to take on, and some of their real acts of bravery, I guess.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Sarah. And finally, last but not least, Rachel.
I agree with everything that was said, and I would just encourage, especially those who have children, grandchildren, that there are sets of skills, like muscles, that need to be exercised ever before they walk on campus. They need to build the muscles of critical thinking, asking the hard questions and leaning into those questions, not to play gotcha, but to really ask the hard questions. They need to build the muscle of holding multiple perspectives. They need to build the muscle of compassion and empathy. They need to feel comfortable leaning into brave spaces, not safe spaces. Of course, physical safety, but brave, intellectually brave spaces. We are living in a world right now in which, through social media, herd mentality, it is so much easier to go with what everyone else is doing versus doing what Sara just said. Going to something, listening, challenging oneself, let alone actually being in an environment that one may not feel comfortable. Because if you don't practice that before you get onto campus, you shouldn't assume you're going to learn those skills on campus, or that will be a hospitable environment to practice those skills. So I think that's a big piece of this. I'll say 2 more things very quickly. 1, you need to be able to have the conversations with your children now. Do not outsource it. Do not assume that educators are going to do it for you. Do not assume that your rabbis are going to do it for you. Definitely do not assume that faculty will do it for you. It's like sex and drugs. If you don't talk about it at home, you should know that they're going to find out about it outside of the home. So you need to have the conversations now in order to be able to understand, provide the historical scaffolding, the context, all of those elements. And then I'm going to say something that I agree with David, and I'm going to challenge. David, of course they shouldn't have to fight. Of course. Meaning that's not what it's meant to be. And I wish that they didn't have to. And I will then say, and now they have to. And so therefore, just like you have Israelis in the service, and they have to give a couple of years of their life to service in the army, we need to prepare our students to give some life of service to the cause of the Jewish people. And if they don't have the skills, they will fail miserably. And not only will they fail miserably, and you have the greater chance of them hiding their identity and becoming Moranos, but you also have the chance of them also becoming more positively predisposed to the detractors, because it's much easier in so many ways. And so I say we have to give them the skills, not because of Hasbara. I'm not interested in Hasbara, but I'm interested in knowing their Jewishness, their particularism, knowing how complex it is, but having the koach and the confidence and the spine to be able to stand up and speak out, irrespective of who's around them.
Okay, well, thank you very much. That's a great note to end on. You mentioned the importance of critical thinking, and I don't think it's a coincidence, by the way, at all, that anti-Semites and anti-Zionists are also the enemies of critical thinking, because I think just as the opponents of just as anti-Semites have always been, anti-Semitism has always been part of the most sort of anti-liberal, anti-freedom ideologies of fascism and communism and Islamism and other totalitarian ideologies. Just so I think it's the case that today we see on campuses that this anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism is the enemy of sort of broader liberal thought and liberal thinking as well. I want to thank you all so much for your time and your insights. Shai, you came with your very personal take, and I think it was really important for us to hear, as I said, both as a student and as an Israeli, especially someone who has a personal connection to one of the victims of the 7th of October, and your own family history with your grandfather as well. I think it was really important to hear, and we really value everything that you brought today. And gave us a different perspective that we otherwise, and I think many of us, the older ones among us, some are even older than me, who to hear your perspective. Sara and David are both people that I've been reading and learning from for many years, so I'm really grateful that you joined us as well. And Rachel, I know that you're doing amazing work, and actually, I think I told you that I invited you after hearing you on another podcast and being really blown away by your insights and your eloquence. So I really appreciate it. All of you. Thank you everyone for joining us. If you want to be on the mailing list for the Begin Center English events, and you're not already on it, then email me, paulg@begincenter.org.il. And I hope everyone has a great rest of the day, rest of the evening. And if I don't speak to you or be in touch with you before, then have a Chanukah Sameach as well. Bye-bye.